That's right. Alan upstairs last night. Good morning. Welcome to Morning Joe. It is Tuesday, June 4th. With us this morning, the host of Way Too Early, White House Bureau Chief at Politico, Jonathan Lemire, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and associate editor of the Washington Post and MSNBC, political analyst Eugene Robinson, and special correspondent at Vanity Fair and host of the Fast Politics podcast, Molly Jong-Fast. She's an MSNBC political analyst. Good morning to you all. We'll dive right in. At a fundraiser in Connecticut last night, President Biden made some of his most candid comments yet about former President Trump's criminal conviction. In off-camera remarks, Biden told the audience that a convicted felon is now seeking the office of the presidency. The president added, quote, "As disturbing as that is, more damaging is the all-out assault Donald Trump is making on the American system of justice." President Biden is reported to have said, quote, "Something snapped in this guy after the 2020 election," and, quote, "It's literally driving him crazy." Biden went on to call Trump unhinged, Joe. So maybe a private preview, Joe, of where we may see President Biden going publicly as his campaign rolls out now that Donald Trump has been convicted on 34 felony counts.
Right, it is, Jonathan Lemire. It may be a private preview, but this is how Biden feels. This is how his campaign team feels. This is how people around him feel. They are glad the trial's over. They're glad that he's going out on the trail. And as I said yesterday, while that long stem winder of a press conference was going on Friday, the Biden campaign was celebrating. They said, okay, he sounds older, more unhinged, less connected with reality. This is why we want him out of the courthouse and on the campaign trail.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, but they're exactly right. Some senior Biden people were eager for the trial to end because they felt in some ways it shielded Donald Trump from the scrutiny of the rest of the voters when then they actually hear him talking again. And he's in their living room again, which he was in that news conference on Friday, which he will be in the debate in just a few weeks' time. Americans will be repulsed when they don't want to go back to that Trump term. In terms of how the president and his team are going to handle this, it was previewed to me a couple of weeks ago. As we saw last week, President Biden's first words about the verdict were simply, we need to respect the process. The judicial system worked, and attacks against it are disgraceful. But now we're seeing other Democrats and the president himself begin to ramp up his attacks on Donald Trump. The Biden Twitter account more than a dozen times yesterday used the phrase convicted felon. We heard it again from President Biden last night. Now, they don't believe this conviction itself is a race-changing event. They do think, though, it will help along the margins, and in a close race, that could matter. But more than that, they think it's just the latest piece, Willie, of this overall example they're building about how Donald Trump isn't fit for office. Look at the lengths he would go to keep power. Look how he's only out for himself and not you, the American voter.
Yeah, and given that this came in late May, this verdict, we'll see how long it can burn through a long campaign, whether it stays alive as a conversation piece. And Molly, you're writing about this in Vanity Fair. Molly's latest piece is titled Trump World's Post-Conviction Spin Cycle. In it, Molly writes this: while many Trump surrogates appeared to go about their messaging in lockstep, there were also some rather stark inconsistencies, suggesting Trump's verdict was not something that Republicans had a clear handle on. Perhaps the weirdest display of dissonance came from Mike Lee, who quite simply could not seem to make up his mind on whether the trial was a boon or a bust. At 5:15 p.m. on Thursday, the Utah senator tweeted that by pushing for and securing Trump's conviction, progressives have, quote, guaranteed Trump's election. But a mere 20 minutes later, the senator appeared to turn on a dime, saying of the trial, I can't imagine a bigger, more impactful contribution to the Biden campaign. A jury has found Trump to be guilty on 34 counts of falsifying business records. In his world, this reality does not really matter. It's something that can be endlessly spun and mangled and perverted into a word salad of projection and lies. But when it comes to wiping off a stain that is this indelible, Trump world is going to have a much harder time, writes Molly Jong Fast. Molly, let you expand on this a little bit on your piece, but obviously we heard reflexive reaction from most Republicans, not surprising at all, given a lot of them were at the courthouse during the trial to support him, saying that this was a miscarriage of justice and the criminal justice system is broken and the country is terrible and all those things because one time it cut against them. How do you expect this to play, though, for the rest of the campaign?
So it reminded me a little bit of the Access Hollywood tape. Like, there was a moment of panic. It wasn't quiet. When the Access Hollywood tape broke, there was sort of silence, and everyone was like, are we going to stick around with this guy? Obviously, Republicans are in it too deep to do anything but keep going. I mean, Donald Trump is basically the central platform of their 2024 campaigns. Down the ticket. So I don't think that they're going to cut and run from him. And in fact, we saw lots of defending, but we saw a kind of very weird defending, right? So they would defend some things, but not other things. They attacked the rule of law, which is what we were expecting. I mean, a lot of it was this playbook, but there certainly was some tacking and weaving. And I also think ultimately Donald Trump is, when they're not completely in lockstep, that's something to look at. And so I do think there were some problems there. Ultimately, Trump was always going to say that this is what he expected and that this was how he thought it would go. But I think they really did think that he was going to skate, or at least skate on some of the charges.
Yeah, I mean, and they wouldn't have been alone. I was sure that there would be a possibility of a hung jury. Sure that maybe there would be one person out of the 77 million who voted for Donald Trump in 2020 that was on that jury that would not take their duty seriously. What I was wrong, and the Trump campaign was wrong. There were 12 jurors who were willing to set aside all pre-existing beliefs, all pre-existing prejudices, and just look at the facts of the case, follow the jury instructions, and convict him on 34 counts. Now, Gene Robinson, you're saying that there's something Donald Trump could do if you really wanted to make America great again, and there's about as much chance of him doing that as the Tories winning in a landslide next month. Why don't you tell us what he could do?
Well, no, he could withdraw from the race because he's just been convicted of 34 felonies. Imagine, Joe, if this were any other point in American history from the founding of the Republic till the day in 2015 that Donald Trump rode down that escalator at Trump Tower. At any other moment in our history, a candidate for any office who was convicted mid-campaign of 34 felony charges would have been out of the race before the jury foreman finished reading the 34 guilty verdicts, right? I mean, it would have just been automatic. It would have been unthinkable that someone would stay in any race given the status as a 34 times felon. But again, we're in this very different world. I thought, as I was sitting down to write a column yesterday, I thought, well, look, somebody needs to call for Donald Trump to step out of the race because, all these sort of, hand-wringing Democrats and chin-stroking pundits they've been calling for Joe Biden to step aside, and the only thing he's guilty of is living to 81. It's just, it's just this weird, topsy-turvy, upside-down world that we live in, and we need to stop every once in a while and realize this is not normal. This is not healthy. This is insane. And I kind of wonder if maybe that will sink in, just that fact of how insane and unacceptable this is, will sink in with some voters over time. We'll see.
I suspect it may with swing voters. We saw some polls over the weekend suggesting that it just may do that with independent voters, with swing voters, especially in the upper Midwest states. But Gene brings up such a great point, Willie. In the good old days, back when I was in Washington, I mean, heck, if somebody got indicted of 34 counts, they immediately resigned from Congress and went to prepare their defense. Here, Donald Trump gets convicted 34 times 34 different felonies, and of course, you have United States senators who are trying to use it as a badge of honor that their guy is being persecuted by the state.
Yeah, I mean, he's martyrdom, right? I mean, he's been compared to religious figures without irony by members of the United States Congress, by people on TV as a rallying cry behind him. And that's the Trump way, though, isn't it? Never surrender, never apologize for anything. Put your head down and keep moving and pretend, despite all the facts around you, that you are the victim.
And always play the victim. I mean, that's always it. Always play the victim. Always play the martyr. You know, he was asked in this weekend Fox and Friends interview about evangelicals supporting him. We even saw people that used to be. I just saw shocking things by evangelical so-called leaders. One of them having Trump next to Jesus on a cross, saying, why wouldn't you vote for somebody who's been convicted? You worship somebody who was convicted. And that shows you just the depravity that many of these people are willing to sink to. It's just straight out blasphemy.
I was just going to say, there used to be a word for that, blasphemy. But Molly, the point of all this is that Donald Trump could not pull this off alone, right? He would be a convicted felon, and he would sound as insane as he does sound in that interview with Fox and Friends over the weekend for 90 minutes or however long it lasted. But the entire party, the entire media on his side rallies behind him and legitimizes his claims of victimhood.
And what was interesting this whole weekend was that the message out of Trump world was, this helps him. Right, we raised gonzo money. Again, we're going to have to wait to see the filings, but it's still a lot of money either way. And he said, you know, this helps him. This makes him more powerful. You libs have done it now, right? Even though, remember, it's a state case. And the other thing is that this doesn't exist in a vacuum. He has 3 other cases, plus all of these civil cases. I mean, this isn't just like one rogue prosecutor. I mean, the guy has done all of these things which have led to all these investigations. So, look, I think that to watch Trump world pump him up, both to try to play him as the victim and to also say that he must stay in because he is the only way that they're going to survive is a bizarre thing.
You know, there is such a bubble, too, Jonathan Lemire, that these people live in. I mean, and even people in sort of the media orbit that I've talked to, they think 34 felony convictions is great for Donald Trump, great for fundraising, firing up the base. Man, people are going to do whatever it takes to vote. It fires up his 44%, his 43%, you know, and ceiling maybe 46, 47%. But you know, they actually believe it. Trump knows better than to believe that this is something that he wants. But there are people around him that have convinced themselves, living in a bubble, that these 34 felony convictions, the greatest political advance for Trump in some time, and they're just completely delusional.
I mean, they're right that it'll fire up the base. They're right that it'll be good for fundraising, at least for the time being. But there's a couple of things here. First, we do know, as we've long said on this show, the way to know what Donald Trump's actually thinking is what he posts on Truth Social in the middle of the night. And it has been screed after screed after screed expressing anger and frustration at what has happened in these legal cases. And also, I've talked to people around him. He doesn't want to go to prison. He didn't want to be convicted. They had convinced themselves they would at least get a hung jury. They were surprised by the verdict, and particularly that it was unanimous. But even if this does help politically with his base, there's simply no way it helps beyond that. Now, Democrats feel there's worries already about complacency, that the members of the base will say, well, Trump's been convicted, he can't win. No, and that's why the overarching message from the Biden campaign immediately was he can still win, conviction or not. We've got to get out there and beat him at the ballot box. But it's about those swing voters, and in particular, as someone in the Biden camp put it to me yesterday, The people who are going to decide this election, the suburban voters, some of them older voters, they care about a couple things. And they care about democracy and they care about decorum. And they're just sort of turned off by the idea, the Biden people believe, that Donald Trump not only is now indeed a convicted felon, but the other part of that Fox interview over the weekend, Willie, was that he threatened retribution. Yeah. He said, we're going to use the Department of Justice to get back at the people who did this to me. And that, I think, is going to be upsetting to a lot of voters who are going to cast their ballots and actually decide this thing in November.
Yeah, kind of confirmed everything people believed about what's going to happen. I'm going to fire off the generals. I'm going to put in MAGA. We're going to have our own people in there. We're going to get rid of effectively the federal government and replace it with our own. A lot in that interview, if you're interested. Let's turn to some news this morning, though. President Biden is expected to sign an executive order today that would shut down the southern border when daily migrant crossings between legal points of entry exceed 2,500 people. According to 3 sources familiar with the discussions, under the order, the border would not reopen until that number falls below 1,500 migrants a day. Any shutdown would not stop trade, travel, or entry by immigrants lawfully presenting themselves at points of entry. However, it would prevent migrants from applying for asylum if they cross the border during the closure. 2 of the sources stress the details are still being finalized, but the White House has begun to discuss the order with lawmakers. One of the sources telling NBC News the White House is acting now because it believes the numbers will rise through the summer, as they tend to do. Department of Homeland Security officials say the southern border currently is seeing more than 4,000 border encounters every day. Joining us now from the border town of Mission, Texas, NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley. Julia, good morning. So tell us a little bit more about this order and what the impact may be.
Well, as far as impacts goes, one of the quickest things we can expect to see is groups who are advocating for migrants suing the federal government and getting this entire thing enjoined in court. And that is because what we expect the president to unveil today is actually very similar to something that President Trump tried to do under his presidency to try to make it illegal for any immigrant crossing the border between ports of entry. That would be in a place just like this, where he built the wall between legal ports of entry, to make that illegal, to make it so that they couldn't claim asylum. That was stopped in courts. That was something Stephen Miller actually came up with, and this is pretty close to that action. Now, what I'm told is this is really the way the Biden administration is lobbing the ball back into the court of Congress. As you know, they wanted that bipartisan deal that Lankford and Sinema and others worked on in the Senate that didn't even get a vote, and of course that President Trump told Republicans not to vote for because he said it didn't go far enough. This is their way of saying, look, we've tried to take really bold action through an executive order. The court stopped us. Now it's up to you, Congress. And they want that message going into the November election, especially if those numbers rise along the border. We do have to point out, though, since December, we saw historic highs in December, over 12,000 a day. Since then, they've remained around 4,000 to 5,000 per day along the southern border. Here in Rio Grande Valley, this used to be one of the busiest spots on the border, Willie. Anytime we wanted to come down, see what was happening on the border, I've seen hundreds of migrants packed under a bridge just beyond this wall. Today, pretty quiet. We've seen a few Border Patrol vans roll through. They might be hearing some small groups of migrants coming through. But by and large, the border has been quieter this year than we saw, especially toward the end of last year. I just have to point that out because sometimes I think we forget about that when we're talking about border politics.
No, it's important to point out. And Julie, you've covered this so well and so closely for so long. So the process now is you can show up at the border and say you're seeking asylum, that you're being persecuted in your home country, and then you go you're released into the United States while you wait your hearing on asylum, and that can take, as you know, many years. Is anything being done to address that side of it, get more judges, more courts, or more ways to process those cases more quickly?
Well, that's what they wanted in that border bill, but without more money from Congress, it's really hard to see how they could do that. We understand that they want to get more beds and ICE detention so that more people can be held while they're waiting that immigration decision. But in lieu of that money, this is to push more people back into Mexico. In fact, Willie, it's a big reason why we're hearing about this week and not earlier, because they wanted to wait for Mexico to get through those elections over the weekend before they announce this, because they really can't do a deal like this where where they don't allow migrants to come in, claim asylum, and get onto that process that can take years unless they get Mexico to agree to take back the migrants that won't be allowed in. And they plan to do that at just $2,500 a day, Willie. We're already seeing over 4,000 a day. It's hard to imagine a scenario where they would get down to that 1,500 people a day trigger to then reopen it. This would effectively shut down the border immediately and keep it closed for the remaining future. And of course, as you pointed out, that does not mean legitimate trade and travel. It means migrants passing between legal ports of entry.
NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley down along the border in Mission, Texas. Julia, thanks so much as always. We appreciate it. So, Jonathan, we should underline something that Julia said, which is we'll hear Republicans in Congress complaining about this today, too little, too late. They had the legislation they asked for sitting right in front of them, bipartisan, led by one of the most conservative senators in the United States Senate, James Lankford. Kirsten Sinema, Chris Murphy worked on it for months, and then Donald Trump told Republicans not to support it anymore, and they walked away from it. So the timing on this, why now for President Biden?
Well, there are two pieces. Julia just hit one. She said they wanted to wait for Mexico's elections to conclude, and that happened. The other timing, well, let's look at the calendar. We're 5 months to Election Day, and that's why the president and his team felt like they had to do something on this. We were right to underscore, and we've been doing it consistently on this show, Republicans crafted this deal in the Senate and then walked away from it because Donald Trump wanted to keep it an election issue. Polls do show, Molly, that immigration remains a pretty good issue for Republicans despite the facts of the matter. And the President Biden and his team, they acknowledged privately they were a little slow to act earlier in his term. They are acting now. They feel like they need to have a show of force, push it back to Congress, try to get something done. But even if nothing can get done, they at least want to show voters they're making an effort here ahead of November.
Right. And look, what Julia said was so important. They don't have the money. Right. So they don't have the money for the judges and the system. And so what happens is you have people come in for asylum and then they are just, they're released. And so you don't have the mechanism to process these claims. And that is not going to be solved with an executive order. But remember, Republicans have been saying, Biden can do an executive order. He can solve this problem. So this is his way of saying, we've done an executive order. Obviously, you can't solve it without the money.
Expected to sign that executive order today is President Biden before he heads off to France for the rest of the week. Still ahead on trial after a jury was selected on the first day of proceedings yesterday. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles has the latest from Delaware.
For the first time in American history, the child of a sitting president is facing a criminal trial. And now the 12-member jury is set. 6 men and 6 women, including 6 jurors who own guns themselves or have family members that purchased them recently. Hunter Biden accused of lying on a federal form in 2018 to purchase a gun, checking a box saying he was not an active drug user, despite acknowledging in his book he was addicted to crack cocaine at the time. First Lady Jill Biden making a surprise appearance, sitting just a few feet behind her son in court. And the president offering his support, saying, as the president, I don't and won't comment on pending federal cases, but as a dad, I have boundless love for my son. President Biden spending Memorial Day weekend with Hunter and recently inviting him to state dinners and defending him publicly.
First of all, my son's done nothing wrong. I trust him. I have faith in him.
But his son's legal battles likely to take a political toll on the president in the midst of a re-election campaign. Hunter's original plea bargain, which would have resulted in no prison time, was blasted by Republicans as a sweetheart deal, and it fell apart under a judge's scrutiny. Special prosecutor David Weiss then charging him for both tax and gun crimes, to which Hunter Biden has pleaded not guilty. Weiss saying he'll rely on Hunter's laptop, writing the defendant's laptop is real. It will be introduced as a trial exhibit, and it contains significant evidence of the defendant's guilt. Prosecutors also expected to call Hallie Biden, who Hunter was dating when the handgun was discovered. She's the widow of his brother Beau.
NBC's Ryan Nobles reporting for us there. Jonathan Lemire, you've got some new reporting this morning about how this trial may impact President Biden personally and as he goes through the campaign.
Yeah, there's no question. And the president is people closest to him believe this will be far more of a personal matter than a political one. Republicans have for years now tried to make Hunter Biden a major issue, and poll after poll after poll shows Americans simply don't care. And in fact, Americans in many ways are very sympathetic to the Bidens because so many of them have also had struggles with addiction. So they understand the president's love for his son. We had Lindsey Graham actually surprisingly say yesterday that he believes, look, because Hunter Biden faces tax charges later this year in California, and he says, here's we're showing it, I think any average American who's done their taxes like Hunter Biden would have probably faced prosecution. He's talking about the California case, but Graham goes on to say, however, I don't think the average American would have been charged with the gun thing. I don't see any good coming from that. So a moment of humanity there from the senator. That's Hunter Biden's argument all along. He feels like he's being prosecuted because of his last name. His father privately also feels some guilt, thinks that his political career has shown a spotlight on Hunter Biden, which has led to this trial. But aides do worry about the president this coming week. He's going to keep tabs on the trial even while in France. He texts or calls his son every day. He's going to talk to relatives in the courtroom. He's really worried about a possible conviction and incarceration. He's worried that it could challenge Hunter Biden's sobriety. This is something that he's worried about the impact of Hallie Biden's testimony. That's going to be a very tough moment for that family, as well as Hunter Biden's ex-wife is also expected to testify. They don't think this will be much of a political issue for the campaign, but they are worried about the human toll on this president going forward.
And Molly, we've said all along from the beginning of this that if Hunter Biden did something wrong, the evidence will be presented, a jury will convict him or not. That's the way the court worked, just the way it worked for former President Trump last week. But on the political side of this, in the media bubble that Joe was just talking about, Hunter Biden is all day, every day, his laptop and everything else, and they've tried to make the implicit case that he is corrupt and therefore somehow so is Joe Biden. Now, they haven't presented evidence of that. There have been congressional committees for months and months and months who've talked about smoke but no fire yet. We're still waiting for the fire on that. They're trying to tie Hunter Biden to Joe Biden, but as John points out, the American public, outside of a very specific sliver of it, just doesn't seem to be that interested.
Yeah, and look, Hunter Biden struggled with addiction. We are a country that has been riddled with addiction, and a percentage of this population has struggled with fentanyl and all sorts of opioids. And, addiction is a real American problem. So the fact that they keep hammering him on being an addict, on having a gun, and also on having a gun, which Republicans really like guns. So I think this is going to keep going, but I do think Biden has a really good opportunity here to say the law is the law for everyone, be it my son or Donald Trump. This is the way it works in this country.
And we'll see how it plays out. The jury has been seated. Trial effectively begins today. Coming up, we'll be joined by two New York Times reporters. Versus Wade. A new book is shedding light on conservatives' years-long strategy that finally led to the Dobbs decision. The book is titled The Fall of Roe, The Rise of a New America. It explores how the right's most fervent anti-abortion activists end up persuading the court to end nearly 50 years of precedent. Joining us now, the book's co-authors, national religion correspondent for the New York Times, Elizabeth Dias, and national political correspondent for the New York Times, Lisa Lehrer. Good morning to you both. Congratulations. Today is Pub Day.
Today is Pub Day.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Your baby is out into the world. Here we go.
It's here.
Deeply reported, like 350 interviews. You really get into the history of this issue. So it's a lot to get through, but I guess I'll start at the end, which is how the dam ultimately broke after this half-century effort to overturn Roe versus Wade. Donald Trump getting in the White House obviously put those three justices on the Supreme Court. But at the end, what happened that pushed it over the finish line?
So our book is really the first narrative of how Roe fell. And what we did was look at the final decade of what we call the Roe era. And what we saw in this period is this tightly connected web of conservative anti-abortion activists were able to move the levers of power in their favor in ways big and really small, working at state houses to start pushing through legislation. And then, as you point out, Donald Trump gets elected. They get really, they jump on that train. It becomes a bullet train for them. And they get really lucky. They get those 3 seats on the Supreme Court. And they're dealing with an abortion rights movement that's really ill-equipped and unprepared to take on this threat. And a country that really has this pervasive sense of denial that this right that's been part of American life for 2 generations could suddenly disappear.
So, Elizabeth, Donald Trump, obviously, evangelicals were skeptical of him in 2015, even in 2016. He had talked about being pro-choice many times in public previous to that. And then maybe ultimately they realized they can perhaps shape him a little bit because he so desperately wants to be elected that they can dictate what they want from him.
They did, and one of the really interesting things we found too is it wasn't just evangelicals, right? That actually Catholics played a really important role in the anti-abortion movement's growth origins. Evangelicals were actually late coming to that in history, and the leaders of the anti-abortion movement actually really were rooted in their conservative Christian values about family, womanhood, and of course abortion. And what our story shows is that it was those values that really were behind the movement. I mean, certainly, as Lisa was saying, but at its core, this is all happening over a period when America is becoming increasingly secular. There's so much cultural change, especially when it comes to marriage, family, and sex. And these are the things that the anti-abortion movement ultimately is hoping to change, right? It's not just about overturning Roe. It's about a much bigger half-century plan to really roll back the sexual revolution.
Joe, you've watched this so closely from the point of view of faith, but also through politics over the course of your life and your career.